Lady Frances Howard, second daughter of the Earl of Suffolk, was married at the age of 13 to Robert, Earl of Essex, who was only a year older. The alliance was dictated by political considerations and had been recommended by the king, who did not fail to attend the gorgeous festivities that celebrated the occasion, January 5, 1606. As it was desirable that the boy bridegroom should be separated for a while from his child wife, the young earl was sent to travel on the continent, and he did not return to claim his rights as a husband until shortly after Christmas, 1609, when he had just passed his 18th birthday. In the interval, his wife had developed into one of the most beautiful and, unfortunately, one of the most dissolute women in England. Naturally impetuous, self-willed, and unscrupulous, she had received neither firm guidance nor wise advice at the hands of a coarse and avaricious mother. Nor was James's court a place for the cultivation of the virtues of modesty and self-restraint. The young countess, therefore, placed no control upon her passions, and had already become notorious for her disregard of those obligations which her sex usually esteem as sacred. At one time she intrigued with Prince Henry, but he dismissed her in angry disgust at her numerous infidelities. Finally, she crossed the path of the king's handsome favourite, Sir Robert Carr, and a guilty passion sprang up between them. It is painful to record that it was encouraged by her great-uncle, Lord Northampton, who hoped through Carr's influence to better his position at court, and it was probably at his mansion in the Strand that the plot was framed of which I'm about to tell the issue. At first, when Essex returned, the Countess refused to live with him, but her parents ultimately compelled her to treat him as her husband, and even to accompany him to his country seat at Chartley. There she remained for 3 years, wretched with an inconceivable wretchedness and animated with wild dreams of escape from the husband she hated to the paramour she loved. For this purpose she sought the assistance of Mrs. Anne Turner, the widow of a respectable physician and a woman of considerable personal charms, who had become the mistress of Sir Arthur Mainwaring. Mrs. Turner introduced her to Dr. Simon Forman, and an agreement was made that Forman should exercise his magical powers to fix young Carr's affections irrevocably upon the Countess. The intercourse between the astrologer and the ladies became very frequent, and the former exercised all his skill to carry out their desires. At a later period, Mrs. Forman deposed in court that Mrs. Turner and her husband would sometimes be locked up in his study for 3 or 4 hours together, and the Countess learned to speak of him as her sweet father. The Countess next conceived the most flagitious designs against her husband's health, and to carry them out, again sought the assistance of her unscrupulous quack, who accordingly set to work, made waxen images, invented new charms, supplied drugs to be administered in the Earl's drinks, and washes in which his linen was to be steeped. These measures, however, did not prove effectual, and letters addressed by the Countess at this time to Mrs. Turner and Dr. Forman complain that "My lord is very well as ever he was," while reiterating the sad story of her hatred towards him and her design to be rid of him at all hazards. In the midst of the intrigue came the sudden death of Dr. Forman, who seems to have felt no little anxiety as to his share in it, and on one occasion, as we have seen, professed to his wife that there would be much trouble about Carr and the Countess of Essex, who frequently resorted unto him, and from whose company he would sometimes lock himself in his study a whole day. Mrs. Forman, when at a later date examined in court, deposed that Mrs. Turner came to her house immediately after her husband's death, and did demand certain pictures which were in her husband's study, namely one picture in wax very mysteriously apparelled in silk and satin, as also another made in the form of a naked woman, spreading and laying forth her hair in a glass, which Mrs. Turner did confidently affirm to be in a box, and she knew in what part of the room in the study they were. We also learn that Forman, in reply to the Countess's reproaches, averred that the devil, as he was informed, had no power over the person of the Earl of Essex. The Countess, however, was not to be diverted from her object, and after Forman's death, employed 2 or 3 other conjurers, one Gresham and a Dr. Levoir, or Savoury, being specially mentioned. What followed has left a dark and shameful stain on the record of the reign of James I. The king personally interfered on behalf of his favourite and resolved that Essex should be compelled to surrender his wife. For this purpose, the Countess was instructed to bring against him a charge of conjugal incapacity, and a commission of right reverend prelates and learned lawyers under the presidency one blushes to say it, of Abbot Archbishop of Canterbury was appointed to investigate the loathsome details. A jury of matrons was impaneled to determine the virginity of Lady Essex, and as a pure young girl was substituted in her place, their verdict was, of course, in the affirmative. As for the commission, it decided after long debates by a majority of 7 to 5 that the Lady Frances was entitled to a divorce, the majority being obtained, however, only by the King's active exercise of his personal influence, September 1613. The lady having thus been set free from her vows by a most shameless intrigue, James hurried on a marriage between her and his favourite, and on St. Stephen's Day it was celebrated with great splendour. In the interval, Carr had been raised to the rank and title of Earl of Somerset, and his wife had previously been made Viscountess Rochester. A strenuous opponent of these unhallowed nuptials had been found in the person of Sir Thomas Overbury, a young man of brilliant parts who stood towards Somerset in much the same relation that Somerset stood towards the king. At the outset he had looked with no disfavour on his patron's intrigue with Lady Frances, but had actually composed the love letters which went to her in the Earl's name, but for reasons not clearly understood, he assumed a hostile attitude when the marriage was proposed. As he had acquired a knowledge of secrets which would have made him a dangerous witness before the divorce commission, the intriguers felt the necessity of getting him out of the way. Accordingly, the king pressed upon him a diplomatic appointment on the continent, and when this was refused, committed him to the Tower. There, he lingered for some months in failing health until a dose of poison terminated his sufferings on September 13, 1613, rather more than 3 months before the completion of the marriage he had striven ineffectually to prevent. This poison was unquestionably administered at the instigation of Lady Essex, though under what circumstances it is not easy to determine. The most probable supposition seems to be that an assistant of Lobel, a French apothecary who attended Overbury, was bribed to administer the fatal drug. For 2 years the murder thus foully committed remained unknown, but in the summer of 1615, when James's affection for Somerset was rapidly declining and a new and more splendid favourite had risen in the person of George Villiers, some information of the crime was conveyed to the king by his secretary, Winwood. How Winwood obtained this information is still a mystery, but we may perhaps conjecture that he received it from the apothecary's boy who, being taken ill at Flushing, may have sought to relieve his conscience by confession. A few weeks afterwards, Helwys, the lieutenant of the Tower, under an impression that the whole matter had been discovered, acknowledged that frequent attempts had been made to poison Overbury in his food, but that he had succeeded in defeating them until the apothecary's boy eluded his vigilance. Who sent the poison, he did not know. The only person whose name he had heard in connection with it was Mrs. Turner, and the agent employed to convey it was, he said, a certain Richard Weston, a former servant of Mrs. Turner, who had been admitted into the Tower as a keeper and entrusted with the immediate charge of Overbury. On being examined, Weston at first denied all knowledge of the affair, but eventually he confessed that, having been rebuked by Helwys, he had thrown away the medicaments with which he had been entrusted, and next he accused Lady Somerset of instigating him to administer to Overbury a poison which would be forwarded to him for that purpose. Then one Rawlins, a servant of the Earl, gave information that he had been similarly employed. As soon as Somerset heard that he was implicated, he wrote to the king protesting his innocence and declaring that a conspiracy had been hatched against him. But, many suspicious particulars being discovered, he was committed to the custody of Sir Oliver St. John, while Weston, on October 23rd, was put on his trial for the murder of Overbury and found guilty, though no evidence was adduced against him which would have satisfied a modern jury. On November 7th, Mrs. Turner was brought before the court. Her trial excited the most profound curiosity, and Westminster Hall was crowded by an eager multitude who shuddered with superstitious emotion when the instruments employed by Forman in his magical rites were exposed to view. It would seem that Mrs. Turner, when arrested, immediately sent her maid to Forman's widow to urge her to burn, before the Privy Council sent to search her house, any of her husband's papers that might contain dangerous secrets. She acted on the advice, but overlooked a few documents of great importance, including a couple of letters written by Lady Essex to Mrs. Turner and Forman. The various articles seized in Foreman's house referred, however, not to the murder of Overbury, but to the conjurations employed against the Earls of Somerset and Essex. There was shewed in court, says a contemporary report, certain pictures of a man and a woman made in lead, and also a mould of brass wherein they were cast, a black scarf also full of white crosses, which Mrs. Turner had in her custody, besides enchanted papers and other pictures. There was also a parcel of Foreman's written charms and incantations. In some of those parchments the devil had particular names, who were conjured to torment the Lord Somerset and Sir Arthur Mannering, if their loves should not continue, the one to the Countess, the other to Mrs. Turner. Visions of a dingy room haunted by demons, who had been summoned from the infernal depths by Foreman's potent spells, stimulated the imagination of the excited crowd until they came to believe that the fiends were actually there in the court, listening in wrath to the exposure of their agents, and behold, in the very heat and flush of this extravagant credulity, a sudden crack was heard in one of the platforms or scaffolds, causing a great fear, tumult and commotion amongst the spectators, and through the hall, everyone fearing hurt, as if the devil had been present and grown angry to have his workmanship known by such as were not his own scholars. The narrator adds that there was also a note showed in court, made by Dr. Foreman and written on parchment, signifying what ladies loved what lords, but the Lord Chief Justice would not suffer it to be read openly. This note, or book, was a diary of the doctor's dealings with the persons named, and a scandalous tradition affirms that the Lord Chief Justice would not have it read because his wife's name was the first which caught his eye when he glanced at the contents. Mrs. Turner's conviction followed as a matter of course upon Weston's. There was no difficulty in proving that she had been concerned in his proceedings, and that if he had committed a crime, she was equally guilty. Both she and Weston died with an acknowledgement on their lips that they were justly punished. Her end, according to all accounts, was sufficiently edifying. Bishop Goodman quotes the narrative of an eyewitness, one Mr. John Castle, in which we read that if detestation of painted pride, lust, malice, powdered hair, yellow bands, and the rest of the wardrobe of court vanities, if deep sighs, tears, confessions, ejaculations of the soul, admonitions of all sorts of people to make God and an unspotted conscience always our friends, if the protestation of faith and hope to be washed by the same Saviour and the like mercies that Magdalene was, be signs and demonstrations of a blessed penitent, then I will tell you that this poor broken woman went a cruce ad gloriam, and now enjoys the presence of her and our Redeemer. Her body being taken down by her brother, one Norton, servant to the Prince, was in a coach conveyed to St. Martin's in the Fields, where, in the evening of the same day, she had an honest and a decent burial. Her sad fate seems to have appealed strongly to public sympathy, and to have drawn a veil of oblivion over the sins and follies of her misspent life. The next to suffer was an apothecary named Franklin, from whom the poison had been procured. Before he was executed, he threw out wild hints of the existence of a plot far exceeding in villainy that which was in course of investigation. He tried to induce all who would listen to him to believe that he knew of a conspiracy in which many great lords were concerned, and that not only the late Prince Henry had been removed by unfair means, but that a plan had been made to get rid of the Electress Palatine and her husband. As, however, all this was evidently only dictated by a hope of escaping the gallows, he was allowed to share with the others a fate which he richly deserved. After the execution of these smaller culprits, some months elapsed before Bacon, as Attorney General, was directed to proceed against the greater. It was not until May 24, 1616, that the Countess of Somerset was put upon her trial before the High Steward's Court in Westminster Hall. Contemporary testimony differs strangely as to her behaviour. One authority says that, whilst the indictment was being read, she turned pale and trembled, and when Weston's name was mentioned hid her face behind her fan. Another remarks, "She won pity by her sober demeanour, which, in my opinion," he adds, "was more curious and confident than was fit for a lady in such distress, yet she shed or made show of some tears divers times. The evidence against her was too strong to be confuted, and she pleaded guilty. When the judge asked her if she had anything to say in arrest of judgment, she replied, in low, almost inaudible tones, that she could not extenuate her fault. She implored mercy, and begged that the Lords would intercede with the King on her behalf." Sentence was then pronounced, and the prisoner sent back to the Tower to await the King's decision. On the following day, the Earl was tried. Bacon again acted as prosecutor, and in his opening speech he said that the evidence to be brought forward by the government would prove 4 points. 1. That Somerset bore malice against Overbury before the latter's imprisonment. 2. That he devised the plan by which that imprisonment was effected. 3. That he actually sent poisons to the Tower. 4. That he had made strenuous efforts to conceal the proofs of his guilt. He added that he himself would undertake the management of the case on the first 2 points, leaving his subordinates, Montague and Crewe, to deal with the third and fourth. Bacon had chosen for himself a comparatively easy task. The ill feeling that had existed between Overbury and his patron was beyond doubt, while it was conclusively shown, and indeed hardly disputed, that Somerset had had a hand in Overbury's imprisonment and in the appointment of Helwys and Weston as his custodians. Passages from Lord Northampton's letters to the Earl proved the existence of a plot in which both were mixed up, and that Helwys had expressed an opinion that Overbury's death would be a satisfactory termination of the imbroglio. But he might probably have based this opinion on the fact that Overbury was seriously ill and his recovery more than doubtful. When Bacon had concluded his part of the case, Ellesmere, who presided, urged Somerset to confess his guilt. "No, my lord," said the Earl calmly, "I came hither with a resolution to defend myself." Montague then endeavoured to demonstrate that the poison of which Overbury died had been administered with Somerset's knowledge, but he could get no further than this: that Somerset had been in the habit of sending powders, as well as tarts and jellies, to Overbury, but he did not and could not prove that the powders were poisonous. Nor was Sergeant Crewe able to advance the case beyond the point reached by Bacon. He could argue only on the assumption of Somerset's guilt, which his colleagues had failed to establish. Somerset's position, however, before judges who were more or less hostilely disposed, with the agents of the Crown bent on obtaining his conviction, and he himself, without legal advisers, was both difficult and dangerous. He was embarrassed by the necessity of keeping back part of his case. He was unable to tell the whole truth about Overbury's imprisonment. He could not make known all that had passed between Lady Essex and himself before marriage, or that Overbury had been committed to the Tower to prevent him from giving evidence which would have certainly quashed Lady Essex's proceedings for a divorce. And, in truth, if he mustered up courage to tell this tale of shame, he could not hope that the peers, most of whom were his enemies, would give credence to it, or that, if they believed it, they would refrain from delivering an adverse verdict. Yet he bore himself with courage and ability, when by the flickering light of torches, for the day had gone down, he rose to make his defence. Acknowledging that he had consented to Overbury's imprisonment, in order that he might throw no obstacles in the way of his marriage with Lady Essex, he firmly denied that he had known anything of attempts to poison him. The tarts he had sent were wholesome, and of a kind to which Overbury was partial. If any had been tampered with, he was unaware of it. The powders he had received from Sir Robert Killigrew and simply sent them on, and Overbury had admitted, in a letter which was before the court, that they had done him no mischief. Here Crewe interrupted. The 3 powders from Killigrew had been duly accounted for, but there was a 4th powder which had not been accounted for, and had, it was assumed, contained poison. Now it was improbable that the Earl could remember the exact history of every powder sent to Overbury 2 years before, and besides, it was a mere assumption on the part of the prosecution that this 4th powder was poison. But Somerset's inability to meet this point was made the most of, and gave the peers a sufficient pretext for declaring him guilty. The Earl received his sentence with the composure he had exhibited throughout the arduous day, which had shown how a nature enervated by luxury and indulgence can be braced up by the chill air of adversity, and contented himself with expressing a hope that the court would intercede with the king for mercy. I have dwelt at some length on the details of this celebrated trial because it is the last, in English jurisprudence, in which men and women of rank have been mixed up with the secret practices of the magician, though for other reasons it is one of very unusual interest. In briefly concluding the recital, I may state that James was greatly relieved when the trial was over, and he found that nothing damaging to himself had been disclosed. It is certain that Somerset was in possession of some dark secret, the revelation of which was much dreaded by the king, so that precautions had even been taken, or at all events meditated, to remove him from the court if he entered upon the dangerous topic, and to continue the trial in his absence. He would probably have been silenced by force. The Earl, however, refrained from hazardous disclosures, and James could breathe in peace. On July 13th, the King pardoned Lady Somerset, who was certainly the guiltiest of all concerned. The Earl was left in prison, with sentence of death suspended over him for several years, in order, no doubt, to terrify him into silence. A few months before his death, James appears to have satisfied himself that he had nothing to fear, and ordered the Earl's release, January 1622. Had he lived, he would probably have restored him to his former influence and favor.